The Tudor period was a truly terrifying time to be alive. Death was always just around the corner, with plague, dysentery and all kinds of divine punishments to deal with. And, as if there weren't already enough ways to die, a new and mysterious illness would sweep through England, leaving yet another trail of death and devastation in its wake. It was horrific, its progression unbelievably rapid. People were just dropping dead in the streets, sometimes mid-conversation. You could be merry at dinner and dead by supper. It was so deadly that it even struck fear into the heart of King Henry VIII himself. It's one of the greatest medical mysteries of all time, one that still remains unsolved to this day. It was the summer of 1485, a particularly wet and humid year. England was at a turning point, the War of the Roses finally at an end. Henry Tudor had emerged victorious against King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and the reign of the Tudors would now begin. At last there was something to celebrate for the people of England. You see, King Richard was unpopular and seen as a little bit of a tyrant, so people were hopeful that things would be better and brighter under the rule of King Henry VII. There were parades and festivals, but the merriment was short-lived. As the new king arrived in London, so too did a new and mysterious illness. It started with a bit of a chill. You'd begin to shiver. This progressed to a fever, and then began the sweating. And this is where the mysterious illness gets its name. The sweating sickness, or the sweat.
The sweating sickness? That doesn't sound very scary. You humans sweat all the time.
Believe me, it was very scary. This sweating was on another level. You would be drenched with sweat, your clothes soaked, your bedsheet soaked, and the sweat, it smelled terrible, fetid, poisonous and foul. You'd feel so weak, so tired, so drained. Your head would ache, your stomach would ache, your whole body would ache. And soon you become delirious. You'd feel like you were burning up. And the thirst. No amount of water could quench it. Your heart would race. You'd struggle to breathe. Then the urge, the desire to sleep would become so overwhelming. But you mustn't sleep. To give in to sleep was often fatal. If you could just make it through 24 hours, then the chances were you were saved. You would live to see another day. But this was no mean feat. Many died within 4 to 5 hours, and the mortality rate was astonishingly high, between 30 and 50%. Lady Luck would have to really, really be on your side. Now, let's say that you're a tough cookie and you managed to survive. Well, no celebrating yet. The sickness might still have the last laugh. You see, beating it gave you no immunity, so you could very easily succumb to the sickness again, and many did. Most terrifyingly of all, though, was that you might not feel ill at all. You could feel fit as a fiddle, but that didn't mean you were safe. People who seemed perfectly healthy were just dropping dead in the streets. Two priests were seen happily chatting away to each other, when suddenly they just both keeled over and died. Others suddenly died whilst out walking, riding their horses, or even playing with their children. Rich and important people were just dropping like flies in London. The mayor died, his successor died, the abbot died, and several aldermen died. The disease began to spread throughout England, and only England, seeming to follow the path of travellers along the roads. It was very strange. Scotland and Wales seemed to have some kind of immunity, like there was an invisible barrier protecting them. A cure was needed, and quickly. But this was a time of very limited medical knowledge. The germ theory of disease was still hundreds of years away. So came the first attempt at a treatment plan. Sweat it out. You close all the doors and the windows, light a huge fire, really get the room nice and hot. At the first sign of illness, the patient was to retire to bed, and you'd cover them with layer upon layer upon layer of bedclothes. The entire body was to be covered, and no air was allowed to enter the cocoon that you'd made for them. The patient wasn't allowed to drink any cold beverages or eat any meat. It was actually best if they didn't eat at all for the first 24 hours, or drink for the first 5 hours. After that, they could have a nice, lovely drink of lukewarm ale mixed with a bit of sugar. They were to lie quietly and not move for 24 hours. Sometimes though, and quite understandably, the patients just could not stand the heat. They threw off their bedclothes and their own clothes and ran out into the streets of London, delirious and desperate for some cool air. It was therefore recommended that friends and family watch the patient so that not so much as even a hand or a foot would be exposed to the air, because apparently even such a tiny exposure meant certain death. Sometimes the patients were covered far too much and sadly suffocated. Now, giving into the urge to sleep often proved fatal, so you have to keep the patient awake, and you would do this by pulling on their nose or their ears. Now, this treatment wasn't really working too well, so next came a more moderate approach. A moderate fire, a moderate covering with bedclothes, and a moderate amount of water. Not too hot and not too cold. But still, not even so much as a hand or foot should be exposed to the air. The sickness, it was cruel. It devastated England, especially the rural areas, but cities weren't safe either. Some reports suggest that 15,000 people lost their lives in London alone, but this figure seems a little bit high. You see, we must remember that writers of the time loved to exaggerate. As always, drama and horror sells. To put things into perspective, 15,000 deaths would have been 1/3 of the population of London. Whatever the case, there was clearly an immense loss of life. And horrifyingly, it all happened in the short space of 6 weeks. By the end of October, the sweating sickness had vanished, just as quickly and mysteriously as it arrived. Sadly, it wasn't gone for good. It soon reared its ugly head again, changing the course of history. In 1502, Prince Arthur, eldest son to King Henry VII and heir to the throne, well, he died, and many believed that he was killed by the sweating sickness. His death meant that his younger brother, the infamous Henry VIII, would now take the throne in 1509. Anyway, back to the epidemics. The next proper outbreak was in 1508, 22 years after the first. Once again it appeared in the summer and disappeared by the winter. Luckily, this outbreak claimed far fewer lives, but it would soon be back with a vengeance in the summer of 1517, and it would ravage England for a whole 6 months. 10,000 people died within the space of just 12 days. People were dropping dead within 2 hours of showing symptoms. It was said that the first shivering fit was regarded as the announcement of certain death. Oxford became a ghost town, and the prestigious Oxford University, well, it was a perfect breeding ground for the sickness. 400 students sadly died in under a week. Monasteries were really badly hit as well, with clergymen dropping dead left, right and centre. Understandably, Henry VIII had been really shaken by his brother's death. He spent a large chunk of his reign being absolutely terrified of catching the sweating sickness, and rightly so. You see, instead of targeting children, the elderly and the poor, like most illnesses at the time, it was mostly rich men who were in the prime of their lives that were afflicted. It killed dukes, lords, bishops and mayors, men who had previously lived life with ease. Now, the poor saw the funny side of this, and they gave the sickness names like Stop Gallant and Stoop Knave and Know Thy Master. To stoop is to bow, to humble yourself, and the sickness, well, it certainly humbled the rich. Wealthy men tried to outrun the disease, fleeing to other parts of the country and abroad. But apparently, the sickness followed Englishmen like a shadow. It didn't matter how far they fled, and it didn't matter that the disease wasn't present in their new location. Somehow they still succumbed to the sweating sickness, while the locals, who weren't English, remained perfectly healthy. It was said that in England you were safer on the battlefield than in the city. It was the English sweating sickness. People began to suspect that maybe the English were being punished by God for their sins. I mean, the English were gluttonous and far too overindulgent with the love of wine and highly seasoned meat. Or maybe it wasn't that at all. Maybe it was to do with the alignment of the stars and the planets. Some blamed the air pollution and poor sanitation in England, whilst others were convinced that England's air had a mysterious hidden quality that was making everyone sick. King Henry VIII and select members of his royal court flitted all around the country trying to escape the sickness. He went from safe house to safe house, rarely staying in one place for more than a day. He was determined not to come down with the sickness. He amassed a large panel of the best and the brightest physicians, and he started collecting all kinds of lotions and potions to try and keep the sickness at bay. He even had his very own remedy, made up of sage of virtue, herb of grace, elder leaves and red briar leaves, mixed with white wine and ginger. His dance around the country was actually working quite well. He'd escaped infection. But eventually, the sickness would creep its way into his royal court, and this sent him into a wild panic. In the fourth and probably the worst outbreak of 1528, his new love, Anne Boleyn, would fall ill, and Henry stayed as far away from her as possible. He made sure that she was well looked after though, sending her his second best physician. I mean, he couldn't possibly part with his best physician, now could he? He then sent her love letters, proclaiming that he wished he could shoulder half her illness.
Yeah, that's why you ran away and only sent your second best doctor.
I agree. Anyway, once again, England was hit hard. In London, 45,000 people fell ill, and 2,000 would die. Monasteries once again suffered heavy losses, and many clergymen lost their lives. The illness swept through the Archbishop of Canterbury's household, killing 18 people in just 4 hours. Celebrations and feasts were all cancelled, and the king's court temporarily dissolved while they all tried to outrun the sickness. And soon, something even more terrible would happen. The sweat would escape the confines of England. A crew of English sailors travelling to Germany suddenly fell ill, and by the time they arrived in Hamburg, 12 of them were dead. The sweat was now clearly bored with the English and started to infect the residents of Hamburg. The following night, 4 German men dropped dead. They had succumbed to the sweating sickness. The death toll in Hamburg would continue to rise. 40 to 60 people would die every single day until 2,000 lives were claimed. The sickness spread throughout Germany, and it would reach Frankfurt, and here a fair for merchants was being held. People from all over Europe were at this fair, and they were mixing and mingling. The sickness would now sweep across large parts of Europe, all the way to Russia. Interestingly, Italy and France remained unscathed, except for Calais, which was under English rule. The sweating sickness would once again just vanish, but it would return for one final attack in 1551. It was this famous outbreak that the renowned English physician John Cochez would document in his book or counsel against the disease commonly called the sweat or sweating sickness. It started in April and was gone by the end of July. All business in London was suspended, the shops were closed and nothing attended to but the business of life. In London alone, it's claimed that 5,000 or 800 lives were lost, depending on which source you read. Thankfully, this time it stayed only in England, and after this, the sweating sickness would disappear, never to be seen again. So, what caused this deadly sweating sickness? Well, to this day, we actually still don't know. Now, there are some really interesting things to note about the sickness. It seems to only appear in the summer after periods of humidity, heavy rainfall and flooding. It mostly affected only wealthy men in the prime of their lives. But this could be due to reporting bias. That fellow, John Cochez, who documented a lot of what we know about the sweating sickness, well, he was a physician to the rich. There were no buboes or respiratory symptoms apart from shortness of breath, and this rules out things like the plague and influenza. And the disease course was far too rapid to be typhus. It followed the path of travellers along roads. Transmission was very rapid, and this suggests that person-to-person transmission was possible. But rural areas which are less populated than cities were hit harder, and it was mostly confined to England, and this suggests that there was another mode of transmission which maybe played a more important role. Some have suggested that it was a type of relapsing fever caused by lice or ticks. These sort of outbreaks are few and far between, usually occur in the summer, are more common in rural areas, and they can quickly disappear. It causes fever, chills, tiredness, confusion and abdominal pain, which fit in nicely with some of the symptoms of the sweating sickness. But there's a problem with this theory. You see, the skin is usually hot and dry, and with the tick form, there's usually evidence of a bite. Some have drawn links between English sweating sickness and Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, HPS. It is caused by acquiring a virus normally infecting small rodents. And it's transmitted to us, mostly, by inhaling aerosolized infected rodent poop. Lovely.
Yeah, I'm so glad I don't breathe.
An infectious agent that lives in rodents actually fits quite nicely. It explains why rural areas suffered badly, and why the illness occurred after flooding. Flooding could cause the cute little rodents to leave their burrows and seek shelter with humans. And the wealthy might have been impacted more because they had an abundance of tasty food in pantries, and the hungry little critters would have been drawn to the delicious treats. It also explains why lots of deaths happened in monasteries. They stockpiled loads and loads of food. Symptoms of HPS include fever, chills, headache, difficulty breathing. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It usually affects men in the prime of their lives because they're the ones usually doing outdoorsy things where they might come into contact with rodents. Sadly, there's still a problem with this theory though. Human-to-human transmission with hantaviruses is rare, and there's still debate as to whether this is even possible. And hantaviruses don't just suddenly disappear like the English sweating sickness did. Some have suggested foodborne causes, such as fungus growing on grasses and cereals, and this might tie in quite nicely with the humid wet weather. Now, ergot fungus poisoning was really common at the time, but this often caused gangrene, and this certainly was not a symptom of the English sweating sickness.
Ooh, ergot, didn't you mention that in your dancing plague video?
Yep, I sure did. Now, the thing is that none of these candidates really quite fit. The English sweating sickness was so unique and just downright strange. Hundreds of years later, the mystery, well, it still remains unsolved. But that's okay. Mysteries capture the imagination to get you talking and thinking. So let me know down in the comments what you think caused it. I would love to hear. If you got something from this video, Gaki and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, never part with your best position, send love letters instead. And I hope you have a magnificent day.